9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR podcast. Hello and welcome to DSR. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this week we're going to talk about the subject that's on everybody's mind. We are fortunate to have a great group with us, including one of our beloved regulars, Ed Luce of the Financial Times. How are you doing, Ed?
Well, surprisingly.
Well, that is surprising. And two good friends who are in a great position to comment on the event that took place yesterday in Quantico, Virginia, because both of them are former lieutenant generals in the United States Army. One, Doug Lute, was also our ambassador to the to NATO. How are you doing, Doug?
I'm well. Thanks, David.
And the other, Mark Hertling, commanded U.S. Army forces in Europe. How are you doing today, Mark?
I couldn't be better, David. It's a wonderful day.
Wow. Okay, Mark. Let's see if you can live up to that. All right. Let me start with you, Mark. You undoubtedly read about, saw, perhaps talked to people who participated in this event yesterday where the President of the United States and our Secretary of Defense spoke to something over 800 generals and flag officers, plus senior enlisted officers at Quantico, Virginia, part-pep rally and part declaration of war on the United States of America. What was your reaction?
Well, I'm going to try and lead off with the positive, David, and it's something that many of us predicted. The restraint and discipline of the people in the crowd in adherence to their oath of office. It was a collective reminder of the professional culture of the military that transcends politics. What I saw was professionalism and discipline on full display in the audience, not as much on the stage. The other thing that I was very proud of was the fact that you had not only the generals and admirals in that audience, but you also, as you mentioned, the senior enlisted advisors, the command sergeants majors and the master chiefs and the command chiefs of the Air Force. And, you know, those guys, I don't mean to be crude, but they have a very high level of bullshit detection. And I would imagine that they were sitting there listening to both of the diatribes by first the Secretary of Defense and then by the President, and wondering what the heck was going on. And the leadership examples that the two were showing were not kind of up to standards of what we were taught in the military.
Doug, what was your reaction?
So I tried to imagine myself in that audience yesterday. And a few years back, Mark and I would have been in that audience, and wondering how I would have felt as the group broke up afterwards and kind of shuffled out of the auditorium. And I think I came up with two sort of vignettes. One would be that I imagine I would have been reminded of some 25 years earlier when a new company commander, think a captain in the Army, is in front of his newly assumed command, so think 100 soldiers, and we're giving, as Mark said, a pep talk, or giving his first orientation to a new group, right? And this new group would be mostly privates and NCOs and so forth. That's what the Hegseth talk seemed to me. It was all about standards and so forth, but it was not standards you expect from the Secretary of Defense, but standards at the sort of platoon and company level, which is perhaps the last point at which Secretary Hegseth is comfortable. But anyway, that was one vignette. The other vignette is a reminder that, you know, being at a partisan campaign rally would have felt quite uncomfortable and disorienting because I'd never been to one. Well, everybody in that audience has now been at one. Because that's what the president gave, a campaign rally. And to follow up on Mark's point, and this is fundamentally a very big point. I was proud of those flag officers who did not applaud at the applause lines, did not laugh at the jokes, and simply sat there with respect, stood upon the arrival of the commander in chief, stood again upon his departure, but in between were very disciplined, subdued, and appropriate.
Okay, well, I'll come back. I have some follow up on a couple of those points, but Ed, I'd like to know what your reaction was.
And you're asking me as a former general in the U.S. military.
Whatever you're imagining you were today.
It's very hard. It's very hard to follow two generals who are steeped in this when we're also commenting on this unique, unprecedented collection of generals and admirals and flag for this weird reality TV show that Hegseth arranged. So as a civilian and a foreigner, all I can say is I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, because I mean there's always a comic element to having somebody like Hegseth who's played this kind of guy on TV, and it's why he got the job, and who has, I believe, a not particularly stellar record as a major in the National Guard. Tell people with experience, with dust on their boots, with 40 years experience each, people who've risked their lives and who have followed, the rules and the discipline that come with training in the US military, to tell them what it is to be a man, what it is to be a warrior, what it is that military ethics mean, and to get those things wrong at the same time. And then, I would not have the discipline to keep a stony face if I were one of them. And I admire that discipline, because it's essential that sort of respect that's instilled into the military for civilian command is seen to be upheld. But in these circumstances, it's kind of a miracle it was. I admire them for it and cry because of what Trump said they were really there for, which is the non-uniformed enemy within, in this country, in our cities. That's a very, very terrifying message in amongst this sort of Charlie Chaplin comedy. The actual message here was terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, there were comic elements to this, to be sure. Hegseth decrying fat generals as he was warming up the stage for our fat commander in chief, or Hegseth Hegseth lashing out against generals with beards, which undoubtedly includes his favorite general, Robert E. Lee, or Trump saying that maybe we should bring back battleships, or that he had a very finely developed sense of aesthetics, and he didn't like the aesthetics of some of the ships the Navy was deploying. That was ridiculous. But of course, there were multiple levels at which this was pernicious, and we can talk about any of them. And clearly, continuing the whole DEI thing and the administration's efforts to purge high-level officers of color and women, it's pretty repellent. But Mark, one in particular struck me, and actually thought of you. You mentioned earlier senior enlisted advisors and NCOs, and I remember talking to you once about Ukraine, and you said, the advantage we have in the West is that we empower these people to think independently and act independently, and that the Russian military doesn't have that, and that was a weakness. And I thought, here these guys are, and Trump even mentioned that he thought Russia's performance in Ukraine was bad, and maybe they were a paper tiger. But if you took each of the things that they were saying, which is, we will not tolerate dissent, we will not tolerate independent thinking, we are going to reset priorities in a way that don't really dovetail with our national security priorities, et cetera, et cetera. It looked like they were remaking the mistakes of the Russian army of the past couple of decades. If you look at that and some of the other things they're doing, that they're dramatically undermining American readiness if you follow through on the things that they were talking about. And I'm wondering if you had any reaction at all like that.
Yeah, and I reached across because I got my moleskin notebook. Doug and I are old school. When we would have gone into a meeting like that, we would have been taking notes because we knew we'd have to take it back to our chain of command. And our senior enlisted advisor, our sergeant major, would be sitting right next to us. And as we would have walked out of the theater, we would have probably huddled and said, holy crap, what are we going to tell the troops? How are we going to relate this to our soldiers when we get back to Europe or Korea or Japan or wherever they were going back to? And one of the things you don't know, David, I mean, whenever I'm introduced as the former commander of U.S. Army Europe. That was my last job. My second to last job was as the commander of initial military training, which is all of the basic training posts throughout the military. So every year the Army takes in about 160,000 soldiers, and we turn them from civilians into recruits and then into soldiers. We do the same thing for officers and warrant officers. And what I was thinking when Secretary Hegseth talked about putting hands on soldiers again and having drill sergeants smoke their soldiers, that's a term that only drill sergeants know, and turning over beds and rat screwing rooms, there's a different word for it, but basically a tornado through the barracks where new soldiers are being trained. We got rid of that 40 years ago. And having commanded that initial military training, we know how good our new soldiers are and how they should be trained in a model that complements the Western approach. And then I thought, okay, we're going back to that because during my time in Europe, that's when I visited Russia about 3 or 4 times and saw them doing exactly that in their barracks to their soldiers, where NCOs would literally pummel and haze their new recruits, beat them with pipes. They would be sleeping on beds right next to each other, and the NCOs and the officers would go through. And there was such, in my mind, beyond the other craziness that went on, was how do we go back? How would Doug and I have gone back after that meeting to talk to our female soldiers and our NCOs and our officers and the guys with shaving profiles because they have a disease that actually causes their face to really be malformed in terms of shaving, that they can't shave. And some of the women who were in jobs where they've been performing in combat arms positions. I had a note last night from a warrant officer a female warrant officer that used to fly us around in Iraq when we were there in combat. She said, I've been in combat arms positions for 16 years in my career. What does this mean for me? Those are the kind of engagements and conversations that every one of those 800 people that were in that audience are going to have going back to their units. And it is going backwards. It is not the modern, technologically advanced military that we have. And whereas, okay, if the Secretary of Defense wants to change the standard on anything, he can do that. But he doesn't do it in a public forum where the cameras are rolling in a live audience and it's being broadcast across the entire United States and around the world, because not only are our soldiers seeing it, but our foes and our allies are seeing it. I'm sure Doug had the same kind of experience I had last night, where I received messages from old counterparts from Europe, not U.S. military guys, but guys from other armies saying, what the hell is going on? You guys are great. Why are they doing this to you? Because they don't understand the politics that we're involved in. That's enough for me to say right now, but it goes deeper in terms of a mission analysis that every one of those generals and sergeants majors have to think about as they're leaving and going back to their home station.
Yeah, and I went and I looked it up after, and I would just point out that something like 47% of the military right now are people of color. And something like a quarter, if you take the regular forces and National Guard, are women.
Right.
And something like 6-7% are LGBTQ. So the group that's being alienated here is actually the majority of people in the military, one way or another, and that has to have a consequence. But Doug, I'd like to pick up with what Mark said, because clearly, you kind of nodded when you said, we were hearing from people, and I'm wondering what you were hearing. I'm wondering. I mean, I can only imagine, knowing you, if you were sitting there and you heard the president of the United States saying, "There's an enemy within. We have to target American cities." How one reacts. And stony faced is fine at first, but then what?
Well, I did hear from others, old colleagues and so forth. And a couple phrases repeated themselves in these follow on conversations, right? One was, what about the old Army saying, disagreement is not disrespect? Meaning that leaders should value and they will benefit from diversity of views. So the willingness to step up, raise your hand and say, well, wait a second, there may be a better way to do this, that sort of thing. And what we heard yesterday was not disagreement is not disrespect, but it's my way or the highway, right? You heard this both from the president on the South Lawn as he was boarding Marine One, the helicopter headed to Quantico. And then you heard it again from the secretary. And then finally, when the president takes the stage at Quantico, you heard it a third time, which was essentially, if you disagree with me, the right thing to do now is get up, walk out of there and resign, which is completely contrary to what has made our Army diverse, strong, and I think just intellectually healthy, that junior people can step up and disagree. Our whole training concept is that the junior most person in the room after a training exercise can step up and challenge the general and say, wait a second, sir, that's not what I saw. This is not quite what happened. They'll then discuss it and they'll do the exercise over again. So this whole question of disagreement is not disrespect, I think, was placed on trial yesterday. The other is the old saying of leading by example. Here you have the Secretary of Defense saying essentially he's going to disassemble the Inspectors General Corps and that everybody should abide by individual measures of discipline, while he put classified information on a Signal chat app, obviously violating one of the most elementary conditions or tenets of individual discipline. In fact,
Well, he did, by the way, also make a good, strong pitch on behalf of war crimes. I mean, he just to add to what you're saying.
right. I mean, he suggested he got into the rules of engagement conversation, right, which is actually pinned to international law, and and those rules of engagement are designed to protect not only civilians on the battlefield but our soldiers themselves. So both of these tenets, these kind of cornerstones of Army leadership, of military leadership, disagreement is not disrespect, and what about leading by example, I think were violated publicly and repeatedly yesterday. And I don't think it's going to take. I don't think anybody would have left that auditorium yesterday from the audience convinced that they were going to do anything differently, because they know the strength and they know the value of what got us to where we are today. Look, everybody in that audience is a product of the military after Vietnam, right? We learned from Vietnam. We reformed the military. We went from the draft army to the all volunteer. We went to our national training centers. We got new equipment and so forth. That reformed army is the army that we have today. None of them in the audience want to go backwards.
Yeah, no question of that. Ed, following this thing, immediately following this, they issued an announcement that they were going to be using random lie detector tests and other things to track down leaks, because it was very clear they're afraid that somebody is going to come out of the event and say, I got a problem with this. And so they're sending a message that they're trying to shut that down. But this is tied to something else that they've done in the past couple of weeks, which is to say reporters can't report on what's going on in the Pentagon unless they have the permission to write about it from the Pentagon, which, is contrary to the way reporters act. And I'm just wondering, from a journalistic perspective, what the message is when you go to that kind of authoritarian approach to free press and the ability of American military officers to express their views.
So I can't remember whether it was the Military Times or the Stars and Stripes, whichever the oldest in-house newspaper is. But I was reading a long essay about an anniversary of that paper and what George C. Marshall said during the Second World War, when I think General Patton complained about critical, subversive stuff appearing in the newspaper, in this military printed newspaper, and it being damaging to his authority. And Marshall saying, no, I'm sorry, but this is good for the troops. It's our values. It's their views that are being reflected. It's good for their morale, but more importantly, it shows them what they're fighting for. This is pretty unique in the history of global military, that it has a publication, more than one, that is critical of itself. So what Hegseth is doing, is obviously far broader than that. It's aimed at the independent media in general. That it's fundamentally un-American. It weakens America, not having the exposure to independent, free media questioning, the holding to account, the speaking truth to power. This is how non-democracies behave. And I think in Hegseth's own case, well, of course, it's the actions of a weak man. He's extremely nervous. He's frightened of his own shadow. I think at some level he must know he's not qualified for this job.
Well, of course, you experienced this from the perspective of, I think you were at Aspen when he said, "Oh, no more. You can't go and talk to think tanks anymore," too.
Yeah, he described the Aspen Security Forum as an evil globalist organization, and pulled.
Well, that's true. Let's be honest. It is.
Yeah, I'm deeply evil and obviously globalist. But the combat commanders, everybody was pulled. Anybody with any Pentagon affiliation was pulled. So not just the combat commanders. And these are people who greatly value the opportunity to interact with counterparts from around the world, but also with members of the media, the private sector, that this is part of their public-facing role in their jobs. And so, this was not, I think, to put it mildly, popular with them, because they understand that the military does not exist in isolation. It is part of the society it serves, and this society is a democratic one that follows the rule of law, or at least we thought it was. Hegseth, the more macho he tries to, cartoonishly macho he sounds, the more I realize that there is a sort of hollow lack of self-confidence there. And this is these are the actions of a weak man.
No question about that. Look, there's one other issue, it was a big issue that I want to talk about that comes out of this, and I'll do it in one moment. This is the moment in the podcast where we say to everybody who's listening, in the general public, we're grateful that you listened. And if you want to hear the whole podcast and hear all the bonus content and all the podcasts that we do, this is the time to become a member, because the rest of the podcast is members only. So if you're not a member, see you soon. If you are a member, stand by.